Hello and welcome to another episode of Sound Strategic. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused unprecedented disruption to global economy as countries have attempted to limit the spread of the virus. This disruption has raised questions on how companies should respond to and manage crises in the future. So this week we're looking at the topic of political risk and the growing need of multinational companies and others to adopt a corporate foreign policy. To help me explore this topic, I'm joined by John Raine, Senior Advisor for Geopolitical Due Diligence at the IISS, and Dr Nigel Gould-Davies, the IISS Senior Fellow for Russia and Eurasia, as well as editor of the IISS's Strategic Survey. Both John and Nigel served in the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office for a number of years and have advised governments and companies on managing political risk. Nigel is also the author of Tectonic Politics, Global Political Risk in an Age of Transformation, a book that explores how changes in the global political economy has reordered the relationship between power, wealth, and values. So for those who aren't so familiar with the concept, perhaps we should start by explaining what we actually mean when we talk about political risk and corporate foreign policy. John, do you want to take that first?
Sure, thanks, Meia. Well, foreign policy, certainly to the non-foreign policy professional, may seem a slightly arcane thing and indeed a lot of hard work. And why would you want one of those if your business is making money? I think understanding what it would be helps answer that question. And for me, there are three parts really to a corporate foreign policy. First of all, to distinguish it from just commercial diplomacy, which is something that all companies do in order to win new customers and new markets. It is, above all, it's about the stand that you take. There's a very strong defining communications element to a foreign policy. Secondly, a foreign policy is something which you hold over time as a corporate. It's not just something in response to a crisis or an opportunity. And because of that, it requires quite a lot of deliberation and reflection. Holding on to it, keeping it consistent, also means that there's a sort of internal communication problem, a team effort required around foreign policy. So everyone in the organization understands where you stand on a particular issue. It's also, lastly, it's very much to do with identifying and mitigating risks, what we call geopolitical due diligence, understanding the risk that you're on. And foreign policy, in this sense, gives you a really effective way of mitigating risks in advance. So for me, it's a combination of those three things. And even though that may seem like the kind of thing that only governments can do, in practice, it is something that can be integrated into some of the best practices of corporates without too much additional effort. But it does require that particular focus and mindset.
Nigel, is this a concept that only applies to Western companies, or is it a concept that has been applied elsewhere in the world as well?
I would say that one of the most striking and dramatic changes in international politics of the past 30, 40 years is the rise and spread of political risks. So if you go back 4 decades or so, political risk, and therefore, as John says, the need to think about and conduct a corporate foreign policy was something mainly confined to a small number of large Western companies, multinationals, usually engaged in extractive industries. Today, it is something that everyone needs to worry about. Not only the extractives, those companies with a big, obvious, heavy footprint in another country, but across the range of sectors, and no less important, something that non-Western as well as Western companies need to be concerned about. The rise of the rest, the non-West, the emergence and then the going out into the world of, in particular, Asian companies, has meant that those companies encounter societies and political systems very different from those they are familiar with at home. And in order to navigate those unfamiliar environments, they also need a corporate foreign policy. And if they don't, they make mistakes which are costly to their business.
I think I'd add to that, Maya, if I may, that another driver for this is universal challenge that all companies face to win new markets and new investment. And whether they're publicly listed or not, in order to get that market, to get that investment, they've got to be very conscious of the likes, dislikes, agendas of customers and particularly investors. And investment funds have been some of the most dramatic hands-on shapers of foreign policy in the broadest sense of large corporates over the last 5 years or so, particularly in the last 18 months. Been striking uptick in the number of funds who have taken an activist position in annual general meetings, in particular on such things as whether or not the companies they're investing in are aligned on Paris protocols, for example. So wherever you are in the world, if you're seeking access to markets, to investment, just more customers, the thing that's driving a lot of this, driving this need for foreign policy, is that precisely those people are now foreign policy minded. So your average customer is, your investment fund is, and it's sort of taking away the choice that companies felt they had for many years. As Nigel said, it's very much confined to a large group of prominent kind of household names. But now everyone who's seeking those basic necessities, enhanced global markets and even regional markets and investment, they're being pushed towards a position where they have to do those things that constitute a foreign policy. You have to take a stand, communicate what you're about, have to be consistent.
I mean, what does this look like in practice, though? I mean, how does a company do foreign policy practically?
So I would say that there's a second trend here, as well as the rise in political risks, the ways that states and societies can harm businesses if they take against businesses. At the same time, we've also seen a narrowing range of options for companies. In the past, say again, more than 30 or 40 years ago, there were ways that companies could deal with the political risks that arose. Going right back to imperial days, simply the use of force. We think all the way back to the East India Company, for example, but other examples too of political threats to value creating behavior simply being coerced or suppressed. That's now illegitimate. It's unacceptable to do that sort of thing. Bribery, frankly, so after force, money was a way that was often used to quieten down or co-opt local political actors that could make demands. That has become illegitimate as well. The global standards on anti-bribery, for example, are now unprecedentedly high. In addition to that, it's no longer possible for companies to say simply trust us. We know what's in our interests is in your interests as well. There is much more skepticism about corporate activity in general. It's much more likely to be scrutinized. So force, money, and trust have become less usable as ways of dealing with politics. In their stead, what companies have to do is engage actively with a full range of political and social actors. And that means understanding the complexities of the local environment that they work in, not waiting until trouble arises before establishing relationships with those who might take against their activities. It involves, in fact, a form of diplomacy, corporate diplomacy, which is a key element in a corporate foreign policy. Understanding the actors and their agendas and learning how to speak to them effectively. And that culture has to run right through the company.
And of course, we see that diplomacy enacted not just at the state or national level, but very much increasingly also at the subnational level, correct? With communities or cities or even regions within a country itself in which a company might invest.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Maya. The sensitivity of corporates to the environment in which they work and on which they rely has grown hugely over the last couple of decades. And if you look at the record on ESG, environment, social, and corporate governance, if you look at the record of those funds, it's a really strong one. I think big big point to note is how successful, how outperforming ESG funds have been in the last 18 months at a time when global equities have been suppressed. They're heading in the wrong direction. So I think that's absolutely part of it. I think the thing with foreign policy that's slightly different is it's encouraging corporates to see themselves as players in an international or kind of multi-jurisdictional community where they have the capacity to shape, and they also have a responsibility to their shareholders to speak. And this is a new position, a very uncomfortable one for a lot of corporates whose instincts will be to have kind of beneficial neutrality. So keep distance from the politics, just concentrate, make your money, and you can drill, manufacture, bank your way through any crisis. But I think the big thing has changed is that those critical groups, your customers, your investors, they won't let you do that anymore. And the clearest indication for that is the amount of activism that we now see in investment funds, including those like BlackRock, who turn around almost on a dime their policy towards this. So taking a very much more aggressive approach.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And what John draws attention to is the fact that companies need to look in many directions simultaneously when they're trying to judge and respond to political risks. They do not only arise from those parts of the world where the companies are doing business. Very often, there are cases where the national and subnational governments in a particular country are not protesting or complaining about a company's activities. The protests, the pressure, the criticism and demands come from a company's home state, from their own civil society. Two famous examples in this respect. The first major global consumer boycott in modern times of Nestle for its marketing of infant formula in the third world. This was a cause that Western civil society took up and forced change. More recently, in the 1990s, Nike's practices in what were described as sweatshop conditions in Southeast Asia provoked criticism and boycotts and so on, again at home. The problems for them did not arise locally, but in their own countries. So they have to look in many directions simultaneously and respond to pressures from wherever they come.
Absolutely. I think also part and parcel of this must be the fact that trade and investment is increasingly being used as a tool of foreign policy. So companies themselves are being caught in this crossfire very often. Think particularly to examples of companies that have suffered at the hands of lacks of Chinese investment or being cut off from Chinese investment due to the originating companies' government's statements on Taiwan, for example.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Maya. There's definitely been a shift from a position where companies would look to their sponsoring government to assist them gaining access to markets and funds, to a position where increasingly they are being weaponized or victimized because of the flag that they carry. And many corporates have tried to distance themselves from a specific national identity, but in times of crisis, global recession, a pandemic, urgent domestic imperatives, that flag resurfaces. So the challenge, I think, there for corporates is, as Nigel was saying, first of all, to keep engaging when you are being targeted, weaponized, instrumentalized. Don't be passive, and don't rely upon the quality of your performance seeing you through. This is a real problem in a heightened atmosphere of nationalism, nations first. Not just because of extreme ideological or authoritarian views, but because so many jurisdictions now are focused on repairing the damage, economic and social, of COVID-19 and the recession.
Yeah, that's a very important point about the increasingly pervasive character of these risks. It's no longer an option to ignore them. If you ignore them, they will hurt you. And again, John said earlier, the traditional view is we just keep our head down, we just do business, we make money. We're not interested in politics. That was a traditional view. Now you have, in particular in the United States, but some other countries too, proactively corporate leaders taking stands on what are domestically controversial social issues, trying to take the lead. I mentioned Nike earlier with respect to the mistakes it had made in the 1990s. What has Nike done recently? It's put Colin Kaepernick on its posters. It's advertising. It's an extraordinary development to deliberately insert themselves into what's quite a sort of polarized domestic political and social environment. But that's the historic shift, really, in mindset that you're getting now. Companies realize they have to be actively engaged, not just watching and responding, but taking positions. And this is profoundly unfamiliar to companies. They've never really had to do this sort of thing before.
That's absolutely so, Nigel. And then you know, as you and I will remember from our former careers, the other side of diplomacy is the influence that you can exercise within a friendship, and that is the opposite to megaphone diplomacy. And I think for many corporates, that's an attractive and an appropriate style of foreign policy, where they've built up phenomenally strong relationships with governments and countries, integral to the economic success of those countries, learning how they use that privileged position to influence positions which governments are taking with which they may not agree themselves as corporates, or which they see as damaging. I think that is a form of diplomacy. It's an element of a foreign policy which many, I think, can exercise, but as Nigel was saying, have been reluctant to. Now I think it's less of a choice. It's more of an imperative if you're to preserve positions and relationships.
And not only with states, but with societies as well. Again, sometimes a state can be perfectly happy with the way you're conducting your activities. The pressures, the indignation, the consumer boycotts or disinvestment comes from activist civil society seeking to impose not government regulation, but civic regulation, the power of reputation and shame to force companies to change. And it's harder to maintain those steady, stable relationships with societies than with states. And what we've seen, even in the past 4 or 5 years, is a rapid shift in the political and ethical landscape around pretty key issues of culture, identity, and so on. And everyone is catching up with these. Companies are learning everyone is learning what's considered acceptable or not acceptable, what is woke or not woke, so to speak. And so it's a constant, continuous monitoring of a shifting and quite unstable environment.
I mean, how flexible are companies, though, when it comes to keeping up with these trends and these very shifting dynamics? You've mentioned human rights, but we can also talk about the current climate crisis and, of course, COVID-19. So how do you see any good examples of companies who have been flexible in responding to these challenges quickly and agilely?
I go back in the first instance to an example I mentioned earlier of Nike, which is interesting. They've learned from a difficult experience in the past. You've had other companies, Target, I think, in the United States, took a policy, for example, on transgender bathrooms. Yes, who would have thought 10 or perhaps even 5 years ago that this would be an issue that companies would feel they need to take a stand on? All these issues about identity, gender, and other cultural issues of that kind. But these can be divisive as well as unifying. There are some people who will boycott a company whichever position they take. But to your question, I'm not really sure there's a clearly emerging best practice. This is, again, shifting and uncertain terrain for everyone. Everyone is learning how to do it, but everyone is aware also that the situation is constantly changing. And learning and experimenting and trying to avoid mistakes.
And the key thing here, I think, to Nigel's point of, it's adapt or perish really in the markets here, is how attuned are corporates to the younger generation who are driving this initiative. And some corporates and some countries are deliberately trying to tune into the views of their younger consumers and employees, because they can see that that is, looking out as close as 10 years, that will be shaping the environment in which they're operating. So there have been some initiatives to do this, some state level, some by corporates. It could be one of the things that decides whether or not in 10 years you are fit and competitive, particularly given the demographics in play in the Asian markets and Middle Eastern markets too. So that's just one of the ways in which corporates need to develop these sensors. The other, I think, is in tracking trends. It's understanding and trying where possible to influence how some of the key governments that they work with are doing the same thing. And there's just a sort of brutal element of survival here, because if you're tied to a government which is just missing it and doesn't look like it's going to correct, you have to seriously consider whether that makes strategic sense. I mean, the argument is not dissimilar to the one over oil and hydrocarbons, is that and indeed bankruptcy, it happens very slowly and then very suddenly. So the tipping point in some of these disinvestment for boycott could be very sudden, but frankly, we've all seen it coming. Again, it's plastics, it's inadequate approach to sustainability and the environment. All these things are they're trend indicators which have to be responded to.
To that point, the oil industry is a fascinating case study, because everyone there is presented with the common challenge of climate change and the move towards a post-carbon age. And the companies are taking different approaches to this. No important, certainly Western player, denies the problem now, but they are handling it in different ways with different degrees of radicalism, so to speak, even as they have to acknowledge the fact this is currently their core business. So how they make that transition and how successfully, and how states and again civil society responds to that will be very important. Final point I'd make is that when we talk about activist civil society and the pressures it imposes, we're normally now talking about Western civil societies. I think what will be fascinating to watch is whether we get significant pressures exerted from non-Western societies, demanding that their own companies conduct themselves with higher ethical, humanitarian, and environmental standards.
I mean, I like that you both speak to the need for companies to choose, but of course, in today's geopolitical context of great power rivalry between the US and China, it's becoming increasingly difficult for companies, particularly in sensitive areas of industry like tech, but also, of course, in the pharmaceutical industry, to have an independent foreign policy. How do you think that the US-China rivalry has complicated corporate behavior in recent years?
It's a massive complicator, and will continue to be so, not just for the large players on both sides, the tech giants on both sides in particular, but for everyone who feeds off them and supports them. So the knock-on effect to supply chain companies, to financiers, is potentially huge. If we see an escalation, tariffs and sanctions, this will affect the shape of the global economy. However, one point about this is it is a dispute which can be solved between governments, and that may sound perverse, but that should give us hope. So you can find a way to a solution, or as we have seen, to a moderation of this conflict, because it is still in the hands of the two most powerful states in the world, and it's government to government negotiation. The foreign policy challenge, I think, for companies here is, first of all, don't make it any worse than it already is. Accidental escalation, if I can call it that. I mean, I'm thinking about in particular the Houston Rockets, whose CEO was mightily regret his comment, cost something like £400 million in lost revenues. These can become disproportionately aggravating to this. The second challenge, I think, within this is where corporates find that they have influence to exercise, not to be afraid to do it judiciously. So there are opportunities and indeed in some sense responsibilities for companies to engage constructively here, but I entirely accept that unless that adversarial relationship is resolved into something that looks very much more like partnering, then just about every company you care to name, and lots of non-companies, NGOs, universities are all going to be affected by this. But as I say, it's just as going back to the earlier comment that Nigel made, it's not enough actually just to be passive and hope that it's resolved. There's both things not to do and there's things to do within that dispute.
I'll just add there's an unprecedented situation. The great era of post-war globalization was a Western-led process. During the Cold War, there was hardly any significant trade and investment between the West and the West's major adversary, the Soviet Union. So the political and military rivalry did not really hinder trade and investment because there was very little to hinder. Now we're in totally different territory. Two major growing rivals, deeply entwined with one another, both in respect of trade and of investment. And the extent of the uncoupling of the two, of course, is something that we wait to see. But it's a new and deeply discomforting environment, I think, for companies and their supply chains caught up in it.
And Meia, if I may just add one thought here, why it's so interesting, this adversarial relationship between China and the US over trade, is that it has dissolved the barrier between security and business. And we've seen an expanded definition of what constitutes national security on both sides. And the Americans have well-articulated concerns over the threats which are posed to the integrity of their secure communication system by Huawei's integration into Western IT infrastructure and government infrastructure. The Chinese on their side have taken a very broad definition under their legislation of what constitutes hostile, threatening, and therefore security-related acts towards them. So I think that, to add to Nigel's points, the why this is so unusual and so worrying is that it has enveloped trade within the definition of national security, and as Nigel said, trade is so big, to find it inside that agenda is deeply troubling. My own idea of a good decoupling is probably less disentangling commercial and even technological relationships. Is disentangling security from trade once again, if that can be done. But both sides have broadened that definition significantly.
Absolutely. And just to go back to one of the very first questions we discussed in this episode, the question of whether corporate foreign policy is a Western applied concept only. I think Chinese companies at the moment, particularly in tech, of course, the Alibabas, the Tencents, and the Huaweis of the world, are finding it very difficult to portray a neutral image, or at least an image that decouples them from the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state system. So this is absolutely, I would say, a concept that is globally applicable, not just to Western companies, and of course not just to tech. The development of a vaccine for COVID-19, of course, and questions about whether health and pharmaceutics should be included within the definition of national security is equally relevant at this moment in time.
Yeah, and certainly the whole the new discipline of biosecurity as an element of national security rather than as a scientific discipline. All of this is posing challenges and opportunities for governments. I mean, it's striking how the opportunity to several governments is looking like it's an opportunity to create jobs, to reshore. We've seen that in Macron's approach towards French pharmaceutical companies, Trump's approach towards Kodak. Here's a very high profile issue on which you can be seen to be putting your own economy fast. Against that, if there was ever a truly global effort required, it's on this, and pharmaceutical companies ought to be able to benefit from the max to international connectivity and coordinated international effort. So it's going to be an interesting industry to watch, and will in itself just illustrate the tension between, I think, what politicians feel they need to do now to secure their position and what the needs of the moment really are.
Just to end, let me ask you each for one piece of advice for companies operating globally with regards to their corporate foreign policy in an era of heightened geopolitical rivalry and risk.
I would say the most important thing is to recognize that it's not an option to ignore these risks, and that an understanding of what those risks are and how to manage them needs to be integrated into the heart of corporate culture. Most companies, certainly Western ones now, have a political affairs or government affairs department, but that's not always listened to. That doesn't always get the seat at the table it needs. It's a sort of an add-on and feels detached from the rest of the organization in many occasions. It needs to be in the bloodstream, because if you get political risks wrong, they can hurt you. They really can.
Thanks. I was going to say, well, we're all diplomats now. To build on Nigel's point, I don't think the option of simply abstaining on all the big foreign policy issues is there anymore. And the international community is no longer restricted to representatives of governments. The most significant non-state actors are now commercial powers, be they ever so grand, like the tech giants, or be they more modest. If you're out there in the international arena, you're a player, and with that come responsibilities and opportunities.
Well, thank you both so much for helping us with and giving us your insights today as to why companies need a foreign policy of their own. You've given us plenty of food for that, and hopefully inspiration for future episodes. And thank you to our audience for listening as well. Please subscribe to Sound Strategic for more in-depth discussions just like this. And to keep up to date with the latest trends in international security and geopolitics, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. See you next time.